Hog butcher for the world, tool maker, stacker of wheat, player with railroads and the nation's freight handler, stormy, husky, brawling, city of the big shoulders. They tell me you are wicked, and I believe them, for I have seen your painted women under the gas lamps luring the farm boys. And they tell me you are crooked, and I answer, yes, it is true. I have seen the gunmen kill and go free to kill again. And they tell me you are brutal. And my reply is, on the faces of women and children, I have seen the marks of want and hunger. And having answered so, I turn once more to those who sneer at this my city, and I give them back to sneer, and say to them, come and show me another city with lifted heads, singing so proud to be alive and coarse and strong and cunning, flinging magnetic curses amid the toil of piling job on job. Here is a tall, bold slugger set vivid against the little soft cities. Fierce as a dog with tongue lapping for action, cunning as a savage pitted against the wilderness, bareheaded, shoveling, wrecking, planning, building, breaking, rebuilding, under the smoke, dust all over his mouth, laughing with white teeth, under the terrible burden of destiny, laughing as a young man laughs, laughing even as an ignorant fighter laughs who has never lost a battle, bragging and laughing that under his wrist is the pulse, and under his ribs the heart of the people, laughing, laughing the stormy, husky, brawling laughter of youth, half naked, sweating, proud to be hog butcher, tool maker, stacker of wheat, player with railroads and freight handler to the nation. Well, that is Carl Sandburg's poem, Chicago. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about this poem later in the PowerPoint, but we're going to be talking about social disorganization theory. Sandburg's poem predates social disorganization theory, but that theory was developed using Chicago, the Chicago that Sandburg described, as its laboratory. So we're going to be talking about immigration, mostly from Eastern Europe. We're going to be talking about the birth of the urban landscape in the U.S., because these are historical contextual factors that played a big role in social disorganization theory. So it's important to understand the role that Chicago played in the U.S. Now remember, in 1893 was the Columbian Exhibition. It was supposed to have happened in 1892 to mark the 400th anniversary of Columbus coming to this continent. Remember, in 1842, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Okay, but it was a year later because of how long it took to get that exhibition all established and set. All right, so Carl Sandburg, he's writing this poem Chicago in 1914. That's a photograph of him. So 1914, keep that in mind. Well, earlier than that, Upton Sinclair had written a novel called The Jungle. Now, both Carl Sandburg and Upton Sinclair were communists. Upton Sinclair a lot more than Carl Sandburg. Carl Sandburg did not necessarily subscribe to all of the political sides of communism, but definitely the socioeconomic sides of it. But Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, it's interesting. He wrote this book to highlight the plight of the Chicago meat packing worker. So he told all these stories about things that happened in the meat packing plants. Interesting thing, the country read his novel, and rather than getting upset for the worker, they stopped eating steak. Why? Because they read how steak was being handled, how the meat was being processed, and all these meat packing plants in Chicago. That actually caused reform, not in labor laws, but in cleanliness laws for the meat packing plants. All right. So the University of Chicago becomes a very strong academic powerhouse by the 1920s and going into the 1950s. Today, we don't utter its breath in the same breath as Harvard and Yale and Princeton and Cornell and the other Ivy League schools, but we should. The University of Chicago had the Chicago New Critics. Now, there's a movie called A River Runs Through It. Craig Sheffer and Brad Pitt play two brothers. Brad Pitt is murdered in the 1920s due to gambling debts, and his brother, Craig Sheffer, who plays a character named Norman McLean, graduates from Dartmouth and ends up being a literature professor at the University of Chicago. We see that in the movie. It's based on the real Norman McLean's story, A River Runs Through It, a short story. The Norman McLean was not known. The real Norman McLean was not known as fiction. He was known as a literature professor and writing literary criticism. He was one of what we call the Chicago New Critics. Now, if you go to your literature classes and you ask about the Chicago New Critics, they will tell you that was a major movement in the U.S. It all began at the University of Chicago. Those Chicago New Critics were at Chicago. Norman McLean was at the University of Chicago at the same time that social disorganization theorists that we're going to look at here in a minute were there as well. The University of Chicago especially was a hub of academic activity at the time. So it's important to understand that. So I mentioned the Chicago New Critics and Norman McLean. So there's a photograph of the real Norman and Paul McLean and their parents. W.K. Wimsett wrote a book called The Verbal Icon. Now, the real Norman McLean was not one of the authors of this book, but was still instrumental in the school of thought that this book resulted in. So let's kind of look at Chicago itself, because this is important as well to understanding social disorganization theory. So Chicago in 1803 was not a city yet. It was called Fort Dearborn on the Chicago River. Now, after it had been there for about 9 years, there was a Black Hawk Indian raid on the and it was destroyed. It was rebuilt in 1816. In 1830, 14 years later, they began to sell lots for the future city. In other words, this is a planned city. It's not just that they built things and somebody went there and they built a house and then other things started to build up around it. No, it was a planned city. And by 1832, the Black Hawk War had ended the last Native American resistance in that area. So in 1833, the very next year, Chicago was incorporated as a city. By 1840, 7 years later, it had 4,100 residents, so 4,100 residents. That's in 7 years. Okay, now, add 14 years, and it has 30,000 residents by 1854. Now, in 1871, it was a much larger city. We knew in 1871 is the Great Chicago Fire, and contrary to everyone's opinion, a cow did not cause the fire. We don't know what caused the fire. There is actually the belief that a woman was having an affair and she was in the barn with her lover and the husband caught them. And in the scuffle, they turned over a lantern and started the fire. But all didn't do it. In 1885, the world's first skyscraper was built in Chicago. And there's an image of it here. It was called the Home Insurance Building. It was 10 stories. Um, Now, by 1886, there was labor unrest. The Haymarket Fair began an era of protest and reform related to meatpacking, manufacturing, and shipping industries, all in Chicago because it's on the Great Lakes. Okay, so in 1893 was the Columbian Exhibition. Now, the Columbian Exhibition did a lot for pop culture in the U.S. Okay, first, it really created pop culture. The very first Ferris wheel, it was not open on opening day of the exhibition, but it was the very first one. Waffle cones. Wrigley's gum was introduced there. The hamburger was introduced there. Electricity was finally accepted there because they used electricity to light the whole place, and there weren't any fires that caused any concern to the public. So the public finally accepted electricity. Cracker Jacks were introduced there. Aunt Jemima's pancake mix. Now, keep in mind that it was this company was owned by a woman who was a freed slave. Uh, Later, this her logo came to be equated with racism, but at the time of the Chicago World's Fair, or what we call the Columbian Exhibition, she is the first female of African descent in the U.S. to truly have such an upcoming company. The zipper was actually introduced at this World's Fair, and the automatic dishwasher. Yes, 1893, powered by electricity, the automatic dishwasher. The other thing that's happening is that the first true serial killer of the modern era in the Americas, in the U.S., H.H. Holmes, was doing his dirty deeds. Okay. Now, in 1894, after the Columbian Exhibition, because all these, the rail union, they were Pullman Car Palace, Palace Car Company was located there in, I'm sorry, the Pullman Palace Car Company. I'll get it out, but it was located there, and they were making a whole lot more money during when the Columbian Exhibition was going on, but there wasn't such a thing as fixed wages where you could get a raise, and it was very rare for you to lose that raise. In those days, employers changed the rate of pay frequently, so the workers, their pay went down drastically. I mean, drastically. In 1899, the first juvenile court was established in Chicago. 1906, Upton Sinclair publishes The Jungle. 1919, the Black Sox scandal, where 8 White Sox players were accused of and actually did throw the World Series for money. Okay, that actually caused some reform in the way professional baseball players were paid. World War One brought many African American migrants to Chicago from the South, which resulted in conflicts with the established Irish, Polish, and German, mostly Jewish ethnic groups that already had their own communities within Chicago. So what's called the Great Migration, we'll talk about that a little bit more here in just a second, but during the 1930s, the patronage system of politics was going on. So basically, politicians paid the police more than their salary was, and so they were more loyal to the politicians than they were to the public. But by the 1930s, the population of Chicago had reached $30 million. $30 million. 30 million people. So immigration is a big thing going on at this point. So from the late 1800s and going into leading into the Depression, there was a lot of immigration in the U.S. To the U.S., mostly to New York City, Boston, and Chicago. These were the primary cities. Although Asian immigration was coming across the Pacific Ocean, not the Atlantic Ocean. So that was happening more in Los Angeles, Sacramento, and other cities in California predominantly. But Eastern European immigrants, especially, were coming to New York, Chicago, and Boston. So you can see a Jewish immigrant here at Ellis Island. You can see the lines at Ellis Island. Hopefully, everybody knows about Ellis Island by now. Okay, so immigration of the Great Migration. We had all these immigrants from Europe, mostly Ireland from the potato famines, but then the ones I've already mentioned, the Eastern European, because there was a strong persecution of Jews and other groups. And there was the Great Migration, which was uh, um, a, a large movement of freed slaves and first generation born out of slavery from the South to the North, thinking that they would be treated with less discrimination in the North than they were in the South. There were very harsh racial laws. They found that the North was just as bad as the South, but in different ways. Okay. Now, Chicago is the fastest growing city in the history of the U.S., to my knowledge. I couldn't find another one that grew so large so quickly. So you can see the different cities here. So we've got 1853, then we're into 1909, and then we're to the 1920s, and then the 1940s, and then here we are in 2006, and how it just lays all over the countryside now. So this is Chicago today. So the Chicago School of Criminology. Now, all of that background is important because Chicago was the lab, and you've got to know about Chicago to know about the lab. You have to know what was being studied. So now remember, all of those immigrants from Eastern Europe and from the South, and they're having to mingle together. They're not in their own separate neighborhoods. So keep that in mind. They're not in their own separate neighborhoods at this point. Although there are, because of European Jewish immigrants, there were a few neighborhoods that were Jewish, all Jewish neighborhoods. It's very rare in the teens and 20s for a neighborhood to be a single ethnic group. So in comes the Chicago School of Criminology, and it's based on the ecological scientific approach. So if you were like me, when you were in grade school, you studied pond ecology. It was a very simple study of it, but we still studied pond ecology. So Robert Park is looking at pond ecology, and he's saying, you know something? Cities have an ecology just like ponds do. So there's a growth that follows these same principles. And to think of, he said, we really need to think of cities as organisms. Now, that city has a symbiotic relationship with its citizens. And having lived in the city of Memphis, I cannot disagree with him. But he also said that cities grow in a radial fashion from the center, moving outward. And that's true as well. In the case of Chicago, it could only move outward in about half of the direction because it's on the lake. Ernest Burgess comes along and adds to this, and he says the growth of the inner city puts pressure on the edges. So as the inner city grows, the edges start to get pressure and push outward more. Shaw and McKay come along in Chicago, following on their work, and they proposed a framework that began with the assumption that certain neighborhoods in all cities have more crime than other parts of the city. We actually now know this to be true. We've done a lot of statistical analysis, and we do know that the vast majority of crime in most large cities tends to be committed in a handful of the neighborhoods, and it's always those neighborhoods, it seems like. And those neighborhoods tend to be poorer neighborhoods, regardless of the racial makeup of those neighborhoods. So high crime neighborhoods have at least three common problems: physical dilapidation, poverty, and heterogeneity. And that's what we're going to talk about here in just a second. So other common characteristics other than those three are a highly transient population, moving in and out, and then unemployment among the residents of that particular neighborhood. So the heterogeneity. What Sean McKay said was that we have all of these folks from different cultural backgrounds coming together, and they never would have committed crime in their homeland. So you have a group of Jews in Minsk, Russia, that have their own neighborhood, and they've got their own standards, mores, and folkways, and they would never commit crimes there. And the juveniles don't either. Why? Because the whole community is looking after all of those children. All the adults know each other. So if I don't punish somebody else's child, I at least see their misbehavior and I go tell their parents, hey, I saw your kids misbehaving. And because they were a close knit community, they didn't take offense at that. They believed them because they didn't feel judged as parents. They felt like, oh, they're helping me so that I can now punish my children for doing what they shouldn't do. So you now throw all of these different people into the same neighborhood. They don't know each other. They don't speak the same language. They don't, even if they do work side by side, they don't know each other and they can't get to know each other. So they're not really forming a social bond the way they used to. Now, remember this when we get to social bonding theories later on, because Sean McKay really laid the foundation for that. But there's the old saying, it takes a village, and the village couldn't communicate with itself. And so they couldn't build up the standards, the folkways, and the mores that they normally would have. To notice the last bullet point on this slide. Longitudinal data, meaning looking over time, showed that it did not matter which ethnic groups lived in Zone 2, which was called the zone in transition, where these are the zones where the crime is occurring. Most of the crime is occurring. Because all groups except Asians, this was a finding over decades, had high delinquency rates while they lived in the zone of transition. They all did. Didn't matter what the ethnic group was. When they were in the zone in transition, they had high crime delinquency rates. When they moved out, they no longer had high delinquency rates. So you can see on this slide, so zone 2, now in the one on the right-hand side, it's called the factory zone, but that's where we also tend to have the poor neighborhoods, the projects, things like that. If you'll see the one on the left, that is Sean McKay's original drawing, and you can see that it says 2, zone in transition. Okay. So here is another rendering of it, major zones in the city of Chicago. Now, remember, Chicago is on the lake, so right about here, from here, well, at least a fourth of that is covered up by the lake. So, but now, so here's how Sean McKay reckoned things worked. Okay, so you have low socioeconomic status. You've got residential instability, meaning they might have to move apartments. They're poor. They might have to move all over the place within that zone in transition, and then they don't know anybody. So they're not really bonding and forming a culture, a full culture with its norms and folkways and mores. So that results in social disorganization. We're not organized. We don't have all of this structure like the norms, the mores, and the folkways. Okay, so there's a lack of informal social control, and then all this cultural transmission that's not really getting handed down. Help someone see the tradition in which they land, and that actually tends to curb delinquency. So delinquency is happening. Okay, now, if we move forward from the 20s and 30s, because social disorganization theory was in vogue through the 50s, when we get into the late 50s and early 60s, a man by the name of Salvador Minuchin was going into the slums and doing family therapy, families that had a juvenile with a delinquency problem. And here's what he found is that the family structure was messed up. They didn't have the clear rules. They didn't have the delineated roles. The alliances were all screwed up. So the father and the daughter might have an alliance against the mom. The subsystems were all screwed up. The structure of the family wasn't uh, working right. So remember, social disorganization or unstructured. So Salvador Minuchin, though in his book he doesn't really give any credit to the social disorganization theorists, he really is born from that theory. So it's very important to understand that. So by 1967, when he published his book Families of the Slums, and these were families he'd been working with since the late 50s that he built this theory on. He was really expanding on social disorganization theory. It was going into the 60s. Urban renewal, all sorts of things like that. Social programs, all sorts of things came out of social disorganization theory. Okay, I'm going to stop the screen share. This is a bit longer of a video, and I understand that, but it's very important to understand the historical context behind um, social disorganization theory. Chicago was a wonderful laboratory and still is for studying criminal behavior. Although, as I say this, I understand that people from Chicago are probably going to be very angry with me, but it still is true. Any city that has high crime rates, especially high rates of violence, can serve as an excellent laboratory for studying those particular crimes. Well, I'm going to see you all next video.